Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman. I'm an entrepreneur. I've worked in the financial services and investment industry, and I've worked in the corporate world as a CPA. And I've also started multiple companies with multi-million dollars in revenue, and I've sold companies with multi-million dollar valuations. You can find more out about my background and about the podcast in multiple places. Our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, and on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @HollandPodcast. That's @Holland Podcast. Lastly, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, where you'll get updates every week when we post the video version of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us each and every Wednesday to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. This week, we have a guest that I have been waiting for multiple weeks for, and I'm extremely excited about. Our guest this week is Darren, and I'm going to slaughter your last name, Darren, so I apologize, Nakonechny. I found out about Darren through a big entrepreneurial article that came out about 5 or 6 weeks ago, and I'll put that entrepreneurial article, the link to it, in both the podcast and in the YouTube version if you're watching the podcast every week. And when I read the article, I almost couldn't believe it, because this was a series that the Entrepreneur magazine does about people that are in a business, growing a business, very successful in growing their business, and they're fighting the struggle each and every day. And the answers that Darren gave were so incredibly refreshing. They were honest, they were optimistic, but they were very realistic. And so when I read it, I said, I want to contact Darren and I want to have him on the podcast. So I reached out to Darren, and after multiple back and forth, he has been gracious enough to join us on the podcast this week. Thank you so much for joining us today, Darren, and welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, as I said in the introduction, your story is so incredible. You basically check all the boxes in the corporate world, not happy, unfulfilled, and you go out on your own. You make that nerve-wracking decision. I want to get into all of that. But before we do that, Flock Audio. I've read a lot about your patented technology, but I'm not an audio expert. Give our listeners an idea of what is the actual business that you do.
For sure. So it is an interesting one. It's kind of unique in a sense in the pro audio world. The best way I can describe it to non-pro audio engineers and whatnot to understand it is, if you think back to the old sort of visualizations or TV or like historical photos, let's say, and you have the lady sitting on the little stools and moving around different phone calls, on a big patch panel with cables, and they're moving them around and so on and so forth. So believe it or not, that original technology was developed for telecommunications industry. That was over 100 and I think it's 100, almost 155 years ago now. And pro audio still used and still does use that form of technology because we deal so primarily in analog routing. So what analog versus digital means, to kind of put it at a high level sort of like description, is analog is very much like your old sort of tube television with the antennas and so on and so forth. If you recall those days,
I do.
So it
sadly.
is, yeah, dates us a little bit, right?
Yeah, we're aging ourselves.
But anyways, so a lot of recordings, pretty much all of them on your favorite radio stations or streaming or whatever, is all done through a form of analog routing. Analog signals. And so audio recording, when you're using these pieces of analog gear that are mounted in the studio, and everybody's seen the big mixing boards and stuff like that, that's all considered analog audio signals. And the only way to ever route those signals from, say, the singer, so let's talk hypothetical here. So audio singer will be singing into a microphone. It'll go into what's referred to as a preamp, which boosts the signal. Then it could maybe go into a compressor, so on and so forth, down into a mixing board or recording interface, and then into the computer, and eventually mixed down to the point where you hear it through your AirPods. And all of that process of moving it through all those different various pieces of what we call gear or analog processing gear is done through analog routing. And if you now think back to the way I described the lady sitting on the stool moving telecommunications and phone calls around,
I love that in the Entrepreneur article. It gave me a good picture of, because we've all seen those switchboards of the ladies kind of moving them, and that was a perfect example.
Correct. Yeah, it's the best way of kind of describing how it's done. And it's just wild that 155 years later, they're still using this form of technology. So what our systems do, and we'll get into it later, kind of how we got to this point in creating the systems, is it brings that form of technology into the otherwise digital revolution, but it still maintains the analog signal. So it never actually converts it. And that was kind of a real claim to fame of what we ended up creating. And it became incredibly popular because we took the ease and simplicity of digital, but we kept it purely analog, which is what our industry really wanted.
Yeah. And is the industry so focused on analog because the quality is better than digital, or why was it so important when you went down this path of basically keeping it analog but finding a more convenient way of patching really through from different lines or connections?
For sure. So you get very technical, but the basis of it is each and every time an audio signal that otherwise is analog right at the beginning starts to go through digital processing or digitization, as we call it, A to D, D to A, it gets converted into packets or bits, and it starts to eventually downgrade the audio to a point where I would otherwise describe it as kind of becoming sterile. So you want to be able to do that the least amount as possible. At the end of the day, it's always converted down to digital because that's what everyone listens to, right? And that's how we stream music and everything like that. So it's just a part of our, regular industry. But you want to do it the least amount of times. It's kind of like let me see if I can create an analogy out of this. If you are to build something, maybe it's an IKEA furniture set, let's say, and you take it apart and you put it back together and take it apart and so many times, the screw holes eventually become very loose. They become worn.
That's a great analogy.
It's just not as rigid or as great as it once was. So that's what our systems kind of do, is it removes that taking apart back and forth over and over time, and it keeps the original source as original as possible.
So to put it simply, if we were back in the 1950s, when you see all of those people switching microphones to patch people through, essentially they would be looking at a computer and they would just be moving, they would be able to patch through that way without having to physically switch the microphones across whatever that big, I don't know, whatever that
patch
big
panel.
patch platform, patch pattern. Yeah, you know the technology better than I. Is that essentially what your patented technology does?
Correct. Yeah. So it removes the mechanical movement and the human, interaction of physically going and moving the connections around. In that process, it also removes a lot, or alleviates, I should say, a lot of the different errors that can happen during that very manual process.
Now, when I think about how in the world you even got to everything you just described, a patent, you guys have products that sell for $3,000, $4,000, like really like highly involved. Like we're not talking about a bouncy ball or something like that. We're talking about something that takes a high level of sophistication. Take us back. Where you grew up, you're in Canada, correct? British Columbia, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
What were you like as a child? What did your parents do for a living? Everybody that, all of us as entrepreneurs, love to hear, how did you get where you got? What is your life story like? And it gives us a sense of, number one, being and connection, but also it's just fascinating. So take us back, give us a little idea of how you got here.
For sure. So I actually grew up on the prairies, which is Alberta. So
Okay.
I grew up in a very small sort of rural community, as most of entrepreneurs do. I'm an only child as well, so I
Okay.
grew up on a farm. My both my parents were farmers, but also had additional jobs as well.
How big was the
And
community?
well, so we lived out of town, and I think the town itself was under like 2,000, so it was pretty
Okay.
small.
Wow. Real small.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and I think at its max it was 3,000, but it already moved away. But anyways, it was around that sort of 2,000 mark, let's call it. But where I actually grew up on a farm, it was very, very in the outskirts. So it was about 30 minutes from town.
Okay.
And I guess where I really started to kind of get into, I've always been very creative, at least from I hear from all my childhood stories, and I do remember a lot of situations. I'll tell you one really cool little story that I always loved, and I always imagined I'd write a book around it, but I'm a terrible reader as is. Like I just can't focus. I can't shut my mind out, so I couldn't imagine writing a book. Someone would have to ghostwrite it for me.
I was
But
gonna say you can get
I'll
a
get into
ghostwriter. It's never too late.
yeah, I'll get into that in a moment. But I was definitely the kid who was always taking stuff apart and wanting to find out how stuff worked. I took apart lawnmowers, I took apart old engines, I
Wow.
took apart, bikes and all kinds of stuff. And my parents always used to joke with me that, yeah, we'll now put it back together. And that was one thing I could never do. But I always liked taking apart, whatever it was and figuring out exactly how it worked. Even though if I didn't understand it, it was very exciting to me. So I was always very creative in that sense. I liked art from a very early age as well. My parents never, ever, ever once told me, no, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this, or in terms of like what I wanted to pursue in life. I remember at one point I got really big into wrestling, like a lot of little kids.
Yeah.
And they were like, well, if that's what you want to do, like that's what you want to do. And they never told me no. And I
That's
think
awesome.
that really helped me grow into a very determined, driven individual to be like, if I want something, I know I can go get it. And I know I don't necessarily have any form of, people telling me, no, you shouldn't do that or you can't do
Yeah.
that or whatever. And I think that really helped with the overall long-term journey. But yeah, so I grew up in a very small community. Only child, was very creative. I like to draw. I like to do different forms of artwork and stuff like that. I didn't get into music until probably around 13, 14 when I started playing instruments and whatnot. But everything else, the mechanical side of it, I always said like when I was little, I wanted to become an engineer, which was funny because I had no basis to ever become an engineer or try
Well, I
for
think
that.
you're an audio engineer. You're basically a
Fair
audio
enough.
technician.
Yeah, fair enough. The little
So,
tidbit story I'll tell you. So one of my first like entrepreneurial journeys, we'll call it. So my mom and dad, and I'm sure you're going to ask us kind of what they did. Like I said, they were
yep.
both farmers. My mom actually owned a business. She owned a computer business, one of the very first computer businesses before the kind of real popular Best Buys and stuff like that came out selling computers. So it was
And
a
what
very
year is
kind of
this
like
approximately?
intimate 90s for sure, like early 90s.
Okay.
And my dad's big into golf, loves golf. So he actually works for our company now. And he's semi-retired. He loves his life in a sense because he just, like, I'm leaving for the day. I'm going to play golf. So he's always been really big into golf. And I
Yeah.
remember when I was very young, golf tees, right? Little wooden golf
Yep.
tees.
Yep.
I was like, I'm going to create a tee that doesn't break. Meanwhile, there probably was plastic ones and all that. And so I created this, I call it my greatest failure as my entrepreneurial journey started. I
We all
created
have
this
to have
metal
them.
tee. Yeah, it was this metal tee. It was made out of a bolt that was sharpened on a grinder. I was very good with tools, and it had like a nut at the top. Is what it was. And I remember being like, "Yes, like this thing is going to be great. This is going to be a great thing." And I remember showing it to my dad, and he's like, "Oh, well, that'll shred a golf club." And so, I mean, you're a kid, you don't know any better, but
Yeah, of
I
course
always
not.
remember that, creating that thing. And so that was kind of like one of the first things I ever really truly created in terms of a product that obviously never made to market. But I remember telling my mom, because she owned her, it was called the computer shop. This is how small the community was. And saying, well, I want to sell these at the computer shop. And you can just tell like parents want the best for the kids, but also
Yeah.
they have to have the reality side of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of neat. So that's kind of where I started my, journey in a sense of entrepreneurship.
So you're naturally
And where I grew up.
inquisitive.
Definitely.
So 13, 14, I love that story. We all have, I think every entrepreneur has some of those crazy failures, but I think and we'll get to this later. I have a question about whether entrepreneurs are born or made, and you had an interesting take and an interesting perspective in the entrepreneur article. But so 13, 14, you start playing instruments, you start getting into music. Tell us when audio really became a passion. You go through high school, tell us, do you go to college? You go to college for audio technician, you get into the corporate world. Give us a background there.
Yeah, for sure. So I started playing instruments, like I said, around 13, 14, got into guitar, really wanted to become a singer, was terrible at it. Went for many, many years of vocal lessons and actually learned how to sing through various vocal instructors, which was a very good thing. And the audio side, in terms of like recording studios, really didn't hit me until later in life. It was when we were recording, I think it was our first full-length album. We had done a couple EPs, so smaller ones, through some smaller recording studios. People who probably had no business in the recording industry, but nevertheless, everyone starts somewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
And yeah, don't look those ones up.
Wait. I was going to say, now, what was this, your EP?
It was my my
Oh,
EP.
now I gotta
Definitely.
find
I wasn't
that.
recording it, but
wait, were you singing or you weren't singing?
I was singing and playing guitar with a band.
Oh, I hope that's out on YouTube somewhere.
Oh, it is. Well, maybe not that one. The later ones are, for sure. The little more successful ones will.
That's awesome.
But anyway, so did the live band thing, played in a rock band for, I think it was close to like when we were relatively notable and we were actually playing a certain amount of shows and we were doing opening acts and stuff like that somewhat successfully for some well-known names, especially around here in Canada.
So you are actually a singer. Like you wanted to be a singer and you really became a singer, not a Justin Bieber star from Canada, but you actually were a singer opening for people.
I was like, I was in
wow.
I would describe it as a semi-successful rock group. And I say semi because we had some really notable achievements that we ended up, obtaining throughout our career, including like national radio play, opening for bigger artists and stuff like that. But it just never got the traction of being fully signed or anything like that, which in hindsight, now you look back and you're like, we're thankful about it, or I'm thankful anyways. It was a notable thing. So I played, back to your initial question, started playing instruments and playing in a band around 13, 14, did all kinds of shows and fun stuff like that. And I never really fell in love with the studio thing, probably until, it would have been 2005, 2007 when I really, really started to love it. We went to record our full-length album in one of the studios, local studios at the time. And I just really fell in love with the process. And I'm like, I could see myself doing something like this. It was the creativity of it. And I became what I would describe, and others who were around, a fairly well-adversed songwriter. That's where I really shined. And so I love that process in the studio because you're doing songwriting and you can stop in between. Live performance is obviously different. It's on the fly. It is what it is. And so I really fell in love with the studio side of things. And that's where I started to take it a little bit more seriously.
Now, 2005, 2007, was that the first time you'd been in a full-blown recording studio?
Yes and no. We were in a studio, actually, yeah, it would have been 2005 when we were first in that major one. 2007 is when, like I said, I more so fell in love with it. And it was just a better experience overall. And I got to had already been involved in the recording process. So I understood it a little bit more. And I started, dabble in my own little setups and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely 2005.
And what are you doing is your band successful enough to support you? Are you working outside of recording your full album? How are you surviving?
Music's a very tough business, especially for an artist. I mean, we all have seen and heard the stories. Definitely not supporting your daily life. I worked I worked full time while we still did the band. I did the band at nights, and we'd take time off, and obviously weekends and stuff like that to
Yeah.
record albums, to go do shows and stuff like that. So I was in a full time career at the time when I was doing it, and really it was to pay the bills. It was
Yep.
to help fund the band and stuff like that. And I ran the band. It was interesting because my wife and I talk about this a lot these days. I ran the band very much like a business, which I don't think a lot of artists do. And I think that was always something that I had in me. And I don't know necessarily where that came from through life experiences or whatever, but I ran it very much like a business. So money that the band would make from shows, a very little bit, we all had contracts and we agreed to pay back in to eventually fund an album and stuff like that.
Awesome.
And maybe, and maybe sometimes like we had like some helpers that we called them our roadies and stuff like that, and we'd give them a little payout here and there for helping us out and stuff. So I ran it very much like a business, but I was still working full time, and it was a full time, very involved job at that time.
What industry was it? You don't have to say who you were working for if you'd rather not, but what industry or what were you doing for your full-time job?
Completely opposite, but I was working actually in the construction industry. Where it started was I was working for construction material for insulation polystyrene foam, which is used in various applications in commercial construction. And I was actually working as a sales assistant for this one company, and I worked there for I don't know, two years, I think. And one of the bigger international construction companies that I dealt with and were one of my clients basically poached me, and I moved over to them, and I worked for them for 5-6 years, I think it was. And I moved up the kind of ladder there. I was never out in the field in terms of construction. I started as a sales assistant, then I was a project coordinator, then I was a superintendent, and then I moved into management eventually. And it happened quite fast for my age, because at the time I was still in my 20s. So
and
there was
what year
a
is
lot
this?
I met my wife in 2007, and I transitioned right around 2008, I think it was. So 2008, 2009.
You get brownie points for knowing 2007 when you met your wife so quickly. So, 2007, 2008. I think that's so awesome. You're working construction, something completely unrelated to your hobby, and really kind of like a part-time job. You fall in love with the process of writing music. Now, is that coming up with the music, coming up with the lyrics, the recording process, all of it, the technology? What specifically did you kind of fall in love with when you first got into that full-blown studio?
Yeah, like I loved the process, obviously, of songwriting and stuff like that. Admittedly, I had no idea about the gear. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't even know what dials did or anything. So it's kind of like funny to admit that now, but you learn quick. Yeah. And definitely the songwriting process, the creativity part about it. And then just like the fact of, you're creating a piece of art that some people are really going to connect with. And I always love that. I mean, being somebody who comes from a musical background, sometimes a song will just, maybe it's a new one, maybe it's a pre-existing one that I've heard in the past, will just hit me, and I'm just like, you just connect with it. I've always said that music is the most amazing universal language in the world, because even if you don't necessarily understand the lyrics or whatever, it just entrances a human being. It's incredible what it can do. So I have always been mesmerized by that.
I couldn't echo that. I mean, the power of music. I mean, you hear a happy song, it can completely change your mood. You hear a sad song. I mean, it is so incredibly powerful. They always ask, if you had to be alone on an island, you couldn't have any humans or anything, you could only have one thing. Secularly speaking, what would you choose? Music is an answer that you hear frequently for people who feel the same way about music that you do, that I do, because it can be so powerful. Now, tell us the aha moment when you're working your full-time job in construction, and you're in the studio and you realize, wait a minute, this is technology that has been around for almost 2 centuries. What is wrong here? Tell us that day, tell us that story, tell us how it transitioned. Give us that background.
For sure. So we'll fast forward a lot.
Okay.
To, I think it was Oh, man, I feel like I lost the last like 2 years. I still can't get them back in my mind. It would have been 2016, 2017.
Okay.
And it was, it's so funny. My wife describes it as, I don't remember it exactly, but I literally rolled over in bed one morning and we were waking up and we're both getting ready to go to work. And we lived in Edmonton at the time. So if you're not familiar with Alberta and the prairies, it gets incredibly cold there, like minus 30 Celsius. So like so cold in the winter.
Oh.
And it's brutal. Your tires go square if you've never experienced that. And that's like when you're driving, the tires go thud, 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 thud.
I'm from Wisconsin, and I thought I had it bad. I live in Arizona now,
though,
thankfully. It is cold, but not negative 30 Celsius. Anything north of the Canadian border, no thank you. So, and I've not experienced the tires going square. That's really, really bad.
It's brutal. And so, anyways, I like I said, I don't remember exactly, but she describes it very much. I literally had just turned 30 at the time.
Okay.
And I rolled
You're still
over
working construction?
Still working there. I was a manager at that point. I'd been promoted and I'd been doing it for, I don't know, 8 months or something like that in my new role. And I'd just gotten back from a convention with the company. And I guess I rolled over and I was just like, I just don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. And I just like, I mentally like just, I was done with it. And it really taught me something. I guess I can get into that afterwards, but and she was just like I was the breadwinner that left the family. Like I had a very good gig in a sense, but I also earned it. It wasn't handed to me. I had company truck, company credit card, company cell phone, all the stuff, all the perks that like everybody's like, oh, I would love to have. Yeah. But to me, I just hit that point where I was just like, I don't want to do this anymore. And
you hated it.
There's a very, I didn't hate
maybe is a strong word.
Doing. Yeah, but I get it. I use that all the time.
Yeah.
I guess it wasn't fulfilling what I wanted out of life anymore. Yeah. And when I hit 30, I was like, I don't want to leave this world without making some form of difference. And music had given me that for a long period of time. But the band had already stopped and I wasn't doing music as much anymore. I was doing recording on the side and stuff. And that was fun. And that's where I was really kind of cutting my teeth and learning more and more about working with artists and further songwriting and working with artists.
I mean, life was happening, right?
For sure. But it just wasn't fulfilling on the construction side. I used it as a creative outlet for a lot of things, but I just didn't want to do it anymore. And so there's a famous, are you familiar with Les Brown? Motivational speaker Les Brown?
No, but I know the quote that you're going to say because it was in the article and I think it's an awesome quote.
So it's actually not that one, but it is my favorite quote. Again, I cite a lot of the stuff he says because when I was going through the major transition and the tougher times, which I'm sure we'll touch on, he had a quote that said, "There's nothing more powerful than a changed mind." And you will never understand that quote until you're actually feeling it. And so when I was leaving the company, so I had rolled over and told my wife, like, I'm going to leave and what's going to become of this? And I said, I'm going to take on the recording studio full time. And so when I went to the company, and hopefully this isn't divulging too much, but I mean, I've been gone for a long time from there. But anyways, I went to the company and said, I'm leaving. I literally, I parked my company truck and I walked in, I shook hands with all, the people I worked with every single day. And I said, I'm done. I'm leaving the company. And they were all very shocked. And the company was so adamant on keeping me because I was kind of young blood, I guess, if you want to call it. And I was a fairly good asset to them. And I was a hard worker and I did a lot for the company. They wouldn't really let me leave the building until I sat down. And so the corporate office was in Toronto. And so until I sat down and had discussions with the corporate office, and they even ended up sliding an envelope across to me. It's like stuff you see in the movies, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And I told him it really doesn't matter because it's not about the money. I'm just my mind has changed. I don't want to be here anymore. I'm done with it. And they keep your truck. We'll get you a new truck. We'll get you this. We'll get you that. It didn't matter to me. It wasn't about the money. Get it. Yeah. And fair enough. I don't, as a company owner now with, some very important employees, I see why they did stuff like that because when you find a really, really good employee, you don't really want to lose them. You want to try and keep them. But
been there many times myself.
Exactly. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's that quote that rings every time. There's nothing more powerful than a changed mind. And once you've gotten to that point and you've convinced yourself, that's it. So,
Now you,
so I ended up
I mean,
leaving the
we got to
company.
back up. So you wake up one morning, Darren. What's your wife's name?
Jessica.
Jessica. You wake up one
Mhm.
morning and you turn to your wife, Jessica, and say, I'm quitting the construction job. And you didn't get
Yeah.
punched or beat or slapped. I mean, nobody gets to do that. And then you go to work that day and you just quit? Like, tell us for the reason that's so important is because so many people, number one, I want to know, what was your wife's reaction? Because
Mhm.
that's the real human side of when people make this decision to make an or life-altering move that can be so scary, and you need supportive people around you. And number two, how did you know? I mean, you have a family. How did you know it was going to be okay? How did you guys get through that? For people to hear that it can be done, and of course it can be done, and that you did it, and you did it quickly, and you changed your mind, and it gave you focus. I want you to give us a little bit more background because it can be very inspiring for other people who feel just like the way you did. You're stuck, you're trapped, you have a successful career, you're making oodles of money, but you're just not happy, and you want to pursue something else. So give us a little bit more detail on how did you get past that fear? You had to be afraid.
Yeah, like it's interesting. So number one, my wife and I have been together for 15 years now. So we've been together a very long time.
Yep.
And I can say having a very supportive partner is so important to the process, because I would be lying if I didn't say, like, throughout the process of leaving a very stable career with a lot of promise for the future and taking on something what I would call fumbling into the gray, which is starting your own company and starting with a piece of technology that you never existed before and you don't know how the industry is going to take it and so on and so forth.
Huge risk.
I'd be lying if huge. And I'd be lying if I said it wasn't terrifying throughout the process. Having a very supportive spouse or family, platform that you can kind of rely on and keep you propped up is so important to the journey. I'm not saying it can't be done alone. I'm saying it helps a lot.
Yeah.
And so my wife's initial response, of course, is like, okay, kind of like shock. But she never
Did she
once
take you
said
seriously?
no.
Like, did she know you were serious?
So being together 15 years, my wife knows that I'm incredibly driven. And when I say I'm going to do something, I just do it. And
That's awesome.
she knows I'm not irresponsible in that sense. Like I'm not just like, hey, I'm going to go out and buy a Porsche today.
Yeah.
I weigh the pros and cons through my mind. And a decision that I usually make has been a week of back and forth in my own head, is the best way of describing it. And so she was obviously like, okay, blah, blah, blah. And she had a very good career as well. She worked for the University of Alberta Hospital in medical research. So she had a very good job as well. So we knew that we could kind of balance it out for the next little bit and kind of get it figured out for the most part. But one way or another, there was going to be a line drawn in the sand, and we had to make something successful at some point or another, else it was just going to be trouble.
Did you have a little one at this point yet, or no?
Not yet, luckily.
Okay.
So that did help. I'm not saying it's impossible to do so with little ones, but it makes it much tougher. I can tell you these days with having a little one, even like having a company that's what I would describe stable and running and growing, it's still tough.
Yeah.
But she was very supportive about it. My folks were very supportive of it as well. And I'm very close with my parents, obviously, only child and stuff, and they've always been very, very close with me. So both of them work for the company now. As I mentioned, my dad did. My mom actually works in the finance side of it, so that's kind of cool.
And they're both like semi-retired.
Yeah, if they'll admit that they're semi-retired, they are hard workers. That's probably where I get a lot of that from.
Yeah, I can echo that. My parents are the exact same way.
So I can tell by, like I said, like how you kind of like started the podcast and stuff, and you sourced me out, and I could see that definitely, like-minded individuals, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Anyways, back to your initial question. Yeah, so a little bit of kind of anxiousness at the beginning, but then support after that. And it really just ended up being that you kind of start the journey, and it's scary, and there's a lot of very challenging times here. I don't want to lie to anybody. I thought about this question because, obviously, I got a couple of your questions early in advance and how I was going to answer this one. I'm glad you did ask it. I guess I wish there was a clear and concise answer to this. It's that whole situation of when you know, and when you believe in it enough, you'll make it succeed. And
Yeah.
in your heart of hearts, you'll know you'll make it happen. I know that's such a vague answer, but
Well,
like
no,
the
I mean,
worst thing,
necessity truly is the mother of invention. If you don't have any other
for
option, you're
sure.
quitting your job. Once you quit your job, like you have to make it work, right? You have to make it work. And that drives you. And I imagine that's exactly what you went through.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you learn so many things along the way about yourself.
Yeah.
That's like a real amazing part. You learn your real strengths, you learn your real pitfalls, and your main priority throughout that whole learning experience is to grow as you do it.
Yeah.
Because I see so many people, and this has always been a real it's always bugged me. And it was more so, I know it was very prevalent across all of North America, the world, call it. It was this big shift in 2018 through 2019 through 2020 before the world fell apart.
Yeah.
to, oh, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to be an entrepreneur and I'm going to do this and stuff like that. And having been through that journey and still going through it, it just always kind of bothered me how so many companies would push this whole pitch deck thing. Oh, or venture capitalists would push this whole pitch deck thing. Oh, come pitch your idea and stuff like that. And it becomes such a commercialized, I guess, industry of its own. And having been through it, and any entrepreneur who has done this and gone through it will tell you the same thing. It is not a TV show. It is not a life TV show. You can't just be oh, I have this cool idea, I'm just going to go and make it a commercial success. It doesn't work that way. And nobody's going to come along and be here's $1 million, push it towards. It does not work that way. And typically, if that does happen, and I know some entrepreneurs from my past who have got this and they've relied and leaned on it and it became unsuccessful at the end because they didn't have that sort of difficulty, right?
Yeah.
To go through.
I mean, listeners, you've heard it right here. This is exactly why I started the podcast. Episode 1, we talked about you watch these documentaries, you hear these VC firms, in 60 minutes, someone goes from rags to riches and everybody thinks they can do it. Darren just clearly described it is not that way. And it's interesting. A light bulb, because I've been in the investment and financial services industry where you're raising capital and you're investing, and not on the VC side, but more on the hedge fund side. But the private equity side, there's a lot of benefit to it. A lot of companies, we have a lot of great technology because of it. But a light bulb popped in my head when you just said that and again, I'm not casting a broad general brush, but it's kind of selfish because they're in the numbers game. As much money as they can get out there, 99% of them are going to fail. They just need that 1%. So it's kind of in their best interest, as you described it, entrepreneurial. Everybody could do it. You could do it. We could do it. And I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. And when I started the garbage company and ended up selling it, I mean, it was the 20s were the worst years of my life. And I was like, nobody told me about this. This is not what it's supposed to be. You're a business owner, you're rich and you've got plenty of time and everybody's working. And I mean, it's just, so I completely sympathize with that. It drove me nuts too. And it's a big part of the reason I'm so thankful that you were willing to be on this podcast and one of the things that stood out, as I told you when I asked you to be on, is just how honest you were in the Entrepreneur article with your answers, because it's really bad when people tell you one thing and they're just sugarcoating it, because once you experience it, it makes it that 10 times worse because your expectations have been set in a certain way. And so you just articulated that perfectly. So how did that, so you were aware of how challenging it was going to be when you made that decision to leave your job and start this. Is that fair to say? I mean, as best as you can know without having gone through it, of course.
For sure. I would say I was prepared for the potential of it going sideways and having to work twice as hard. Yeah. I always lived by a quote for forever, and since before I can remember. And another thing, it's this whole thing of this whole entrepreneur and this mindset thing and the commercialization of it. They always say, oh, it's okay to fail. It's okay to fail. It's okay to fail. And I never understood that. I never really could connect with that. I get it. Yeah. But it was just almost like a cop out. So I always lived by a quote of, I don't know how to fail. And what I mean by that is it's not that things don't work out.
Yes.
It's that I won't accept that failure. I'll accept it as a reason to pivot or make a change. But I won't ever, maybe it's like the pride and proudness in me. I always remind myself, you don't know how to fail. You don't know how. And so if something goes sideways, you fix it. If something didn't quite work out specifically, and trust me, this has happened in Flock Audio's history and has happened up until today when I had a meeting with engineers. Like it happens on a regular basis and you just have to learn how to deal with it. But you don't declare defeat, I guess, is the way. And maybe that's the way I was brought up. I was brought up in a very loving but very strong-willed family of like, you have to fight for what you want in life. And so,
grit
I always
and perseverance.
use that expression. Absolutely. I love it. I love to use grit because I use that all the time.
It's well, and it's so key and it's so important. So I wanna take a step back on, a lot of people don't know what to start. They want to start a business. They know they want to. They have that entrepreneurial drive. And I'm not talking about this, oh yeah, I want to do this and make ice cream. I'm talking about people that are in the corporate world. They're serious. They know they have that entrepreneurial bug. They're afraid, but they're ready to make that jump. They're just not sure what to do. How did you know? Take us back to that aha moment, because it's one thing to start a restaurant. I mean, that's a very challenging industry, but we're talking about, you have a patented technology. Okay, the patent process is something unto its own. You have a piece of equipment that's highly mechanicalized. I mean, and I can't even believe that this is 2016 and 2017, and you're here in 2023. This is what you've developed in that short period of time. Because when I look at your products, I'm like, I basically in my whole life, I'd never come up with that. And then maybe 3 more lifetimes after that. So I want you to give us an idea of, how did you just stumble on that? I mean, tell us that.
For sure. So I left my job. I officially left it. And I was running the recording studio full time. My wife and I invested a whole bunch of money of what we had in our savings to finish our basement, actually, and build it out into a full-fledged recording studio. And so I was recording artists, and, reputation was growing. Obviously, a lot of people knew me in the industry already, in the local industry, from playing in the band and stuff like that. So they knew kind of like and more or less, I wasn't like completely green to the whole industry.
You knew you'd be able to generate some revenue, basically, if you because you had the connections and awesome, makes sense.
The marketing and branding side, from it. So I was starting to get more clients. It was getting busier. I was starting to accumulate more analog hardware processing, and I was like, okay, like, I'm at a point now where I've maxed out channels, and we call them channels, and that's just inputs and outputs in my recording interface. And I said, okay, I need something that I can basically have as a central hub to be able to move different gear in and out of signal chains, as I described earlier, going from microphone, preamp, compressor, so on and so forth. And I'm looking around and I'm like, why? Like, there's a couple like okay products out there. Could probably like sort of do it in a okay manner, I guess. I don't want to use bad language here.
No, I know. I get it.
And then there was traditional patch bass. And I'm like, I don't want this. Like, this just doesn't make sense. So I did hours and hours of research. Why doesn't this exist? Is there a reason? Did somebody try this and it failed? I couldn't find anything. And our industry, as vast as it is, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, is still small enough that you can search out and kind of like connect with people and be like, hey, like, what would you recommend for this situation of analog writing? Nothing. Nobody could really recommend anything. Really? So I devised in my mind, and obviously what you first think a product is going to become and conceptualize is not what it will become. It's an amazing thing to learn, right? You know what I'm talking about.
The iteration process can drive you mad when it comes to products.
Absolutely. Keep you up at night.
Yes.
And so where it actually started is I started literally just sketching out kind of designs on my iPad at the time. It had the Apple Pencil and stuff. I started just sketching out designs and being a creative person. I'm like, yeah, this would go here and stuff. And I really fell in love with the product design portion of it. And I'm like, this is so cool. And I can move this here and stuff like that. And I eventually got connected with a patent attorney, and I said, I want to patent this idea. And he was like, I'll tell you how this works. No, I love him. Like, we've been working together now for like going on 7 years. Very, very loyal to each other and stuff, and he is fantastic.
Is he in Canada?
He do it like that. He's so much like, yes, he is.
Okay.
He's a very, very, very good patent attorney and very good legal counsel. He's actually legal counsel for Flock. But anyways, he didn't smack me or anything and say anything like that. It was more so like an abrupt hit of being like, let me explain to you how the process works.
Yeah.
Make sure this thing can even be developed before you're patenting it. Like, what are you patenting? Everybody thinks you just walk into a patent like attorney and be like, I want to patent this idea. It doesn't work that way.
It's funny. It's funny you say that. I had a 45-minute call with a patent attorney earlier today and learned quite a bit about the process. And I had done some research, people think you file a patent. Well, no, so keep going.
It's so convoluted.
It's just boggles the mind.
So he had said, like, well, who's building this thing? And I said, I don't know. Like, we'll find somebody. Everybody thinks, oh, we'll just get it done here and then we'll ship it off to China and they'll build it. And then Bob's your uncle, you have a product. Again, it doesn't work that way. It's not the reality. So he's like, listen, I'm going to connect you with a team of engineers that I know. And like, let's just see if this thing can be patented or it can be even created before we even figure out what we're patenting here. So he kind of connected me with now the team of engineers I've been working with for 7 years. And I still remember I was a pretty green kid. I still describe myself as a kid. I was 30.
Yeah,
I was walking in there.
Yeah.
And the engineers have sat down with him and I'm kind of explaining. We had scheduled this meeting. It was a consult. And I was explaining my idea. And you could tell they're just looking at me being like, oh, okay. Like, why? And like, do you have an idea how this is? And I'm showing my sketches and stuff. And they're just like, I'm sure early on they were probably like, we get it. Like, you're very driven and stuff, but like, we can probably build it for you, but it takes a lot more than that. One thing they didn't maybe know about me at that time is what a driven individual I was. And I remember many times throughout the process of like starting to create this, they were like, I don't know if you do that. And I always had that like whole sort of like attitude towards them, like, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to figure it out. We're going to make it happen. And I do firmly believe they are incredible engineers, this team. And that's why I worked with them for past 7 years. But I do truly believe it kind of got them excited about the project too and kept them so driven to figure it out. We created something pretty amazing out of it.
Well, you did. And I love what you described because everybody is going to underestimate you. And if you don't have the confidence and the drive and believe really, truly, not a fake on the outside believe and tell people and you're just really trying to convince, but in your heart of hearts, you believe it can be done, you won't succeed. But if you do, there's no stopping you. And that's exactly what you just described.
I've always been the person, and I mean, now going on 6 years, we've been through multiple different suppliers of parts and materials and custom parts that have to be designed in specific facilities. I've always been the person, and now I've really like passed that down to my team as well, my employees. If said supplier says they can't do it or they won't do it or they put up a fuss about it or whatever it may be, you can find somebody else. There are so many different manufacturers out there in terms of custom parts and different sorts of suppliers. Yeah. Because one tells you no, that just leads you to open a different door to another great opportunity. And I learned that early on when we were first starting to build this. I was very fortunate in terms of finding a great engineering team early on, and we didn't have to go and source through different ones and so on. And same with the patent attorney as well. So I was very fortunate that way. So anyways, they sent me off to the engineering team. We started discussing, we started to conceptualize what this design and this product would end up becoming. And you soon learned that, well, you can't have a switch there because there's circuit boards and we call them PCBs, printed circuit boards. They don't sit in specific spots, so you can't have that. And so there was a lot of sort of like changing the design based on the, like what you envisioned it onto practicality and what would be manufacturable at the end of the day. And that's kind of where the journey started with that. Yeah. We started with the one product, and now we're announcing 2 more products next month. So that'll bring us up to 6, 7 products.
Isn't, when you look back, isn't it crazy? Okay,
you mentioned something early on, and I got to touch on, I'm glad you kind of just said this. As you grow, as you start to kind of like grow your company, gain success and stuff like that, I hate to say you start chasing your tail because you forget to appreciate what you've accomplished. And like I tell my folks this sometimes, like I said, they work for the company, and at the end of the day, we're a very calm company. We even have a kegerator at our office. And so we
Some
have
of the best companies do.
There you go. And we'll just kind of like sit there, and I often say, like, can you believe that like these farm folk from this small little like community build this advanced technology that's used in, you know, multi-million-dollar studios and like stuff that people are listening to on the radio or watching TV, Netflix or whatever. Like our audio is processed through it. Like you don't stop enough to think about it. That part is kind of, that's sad, that part. I hate to say it, but you end up, like I said, chasing your tail, and you're just on to the next thing. You just get so enveloped in it.
But you know what? This is crazy. This is like telepathic. We talked about patents. I talked one today. I sent out a tweet about 2 or 3 days ago, exactly what you just described, and it shows how much an individual can mature. And the tweet said what you just said. So frequently do we forget to enjoy the process. Just sit back and enjoy the process. And I myself, and I'm sure you experience this, and when I'm running my companies, and I just, you get caught up in the hustle and bustle, and you got to do legal, and you got to do customer service, you got to do this, and you're always stressed. And it's still a huge challenge for me, and I'm curious to hear your experience on this. Just sit back sometimes and enjoy the process, because if you can't do that, is it really worth it? You're back working for corporate America, or and feeling basically unfulfilled.
Exactly. No, you hit the nail right on the head. You have to enjoy the process, because when you make it to that end point, and I'll give an example of this in a moment, it is not as fulfilling as you thought it would be during the process. And a perfect example of it is, I remember when I started and I announced the product, and we were about a year from shipping it, and there was all the kind of trials and tribulations in between and so on and so forth. I remember watching people post stuff on our industry is very big on Instagram in terms of pro audio for marketing and advertising.
Yep.
And I remember watching other brands post about their gear in other, you know, studios. I just remember telling myself, I'm so excited to see that. I'm so excited to see that. It's just going to be so fulfilling, right? It's not even about the money. It's to see your brand and stuff that you created in there.
Yeah.
And I can tell you 6 years down the road, I mean, with thousands of customers worldwide, never really ever thought like what it would become like this. And I still have trouble slowing down to enjoy that and just seeing that and acknowledging that this is a product, never existed, you created, and now somebody who is an audio professional uses this every single day. And I try to remind myself that, well, you were in a studio using gear just like this. And like, did they appreciate it? Or like, is it just kind of full circle like that? So it's a forever, never ending chase. But again, you're right. You have to enjoy the process. At the same time, every day I get to wake up. I get to choose more or less when I go to work. I always go in early. But
every successful entrepreneur does.
But I don't have to, I guess, I don't have to convince myself to wake up in the morning and say, okay, you got to take on another day and stuff. Don't get me wrong. It's not all beautiful, happy days. You know well enough about this, what I'm describing. It's not like you bounce out of bed and you're like, let's go. It doesn't happen like that, because there are hard days, even when you are successful. But at the same time, even the bad days are better days than the bad days at the previous, working for somebody.
So perfect segue into, I could keep you here for 4 hours, but you've already been very gracious with your time, so I'm not going to do that.
We have a good back and forth here.
It's again, the reason this, I started this is so powerful. I get so much enjoyment just having these conversations with other entrepreneurs that I never got to have previously. And that's really why I want to continue doing this, because you just can't find like-minded individuals this frequently in your daily life. Not that there aren't there, but a lot of people don't know what you're going through as an entrepreneur and a business owner and all the things.
Can I add something to that?
Please do.
There was one day, there's been multiple times, but I told my wife the loneliest part of the journey is being an entrepreneur, because your friends that you were once friends with and they work regular jobs and stuff like that, they don't understand. You know exactly what I'm getting at.
Oh, yes, I
And
do.
it is so lonely to be an entrepreneur. It is so lonely. And that is in itself a challenge you have to learn to overcome, because you're once really great friends you don't connect with anymore necessarily. They don't understand what you're going through. And even when you meet other entrepreneurs, it's tough. It's tough to connect, right? Because let's face it, again, back to the whole 2018, 2019 rush of entrepreneurship, everybody's kind of they're not humble. They're very like, oh, I'm creating this, I'm doing this, blah, blah, blah. And not to speak ill of anybody, but a lot of entrepreneurs kind of have the puffed up chest. And when you've actually been through it, you're like, there's no reason to be like that.
No. Well, and the thing is that's when someone is superficial, they haven't actually been through it, and they can't have the type of connection, and they don't understand the value, number one, of other people. And I had to learn that, when I was early in my 20s, I was an arrogant punk. I mean, if I saw myself, you and I are basically twins, is what I'm discovering. If I saw myself today, I'd probably just punch me in the face and say, "Get off your high horse."
In the past, and I'm like, why? Like, why?
Yeah.
It's embarrassing. There weren't camera phones back then. That's all I can say. There was really no social media or anything.
So, could you imagine? We would both basically be what do you call that? Crossed off, or we'd be done.
Chastised.
Chastised. So I wanna you bring up, and that's the part that the lonely days, and the part that is, you said it perfectly. Our minds are not wired to experience the level of loneliness. And for me, and it sounds like it's very much the same thing for you, it was a mental shift in the business, and the volatility. And I want to ask how you coped with this. The volatility, the highs were so high and the lows were so low in business that in order for me personally to deal with them, I almost had to turn off all emotion. Otherwise, I couldn't figure it out. But the sad thing is it extended past the business life into the personal life. And the things you should have been excited about in the personal life, it was just like, oh yeah, that's fantastic. But you had kind of realized, that's how I coped with it. So I want to hear how you coped with it. But I eventually learned, okay, this isn't healthy. You got to find a way to deal with it. You still got to be excited about the exciting things in life, and still you've got to have sadness about the sad things in life. You can't turn off your emotions, but you do need, in business particularly, you got to find a way to deal with the extreme volatility. How have you learned to cope with that?
It changed over the years, without a doubt. In the very early days, I did really rely on doing research in terms of just even like off YouTube and stuff like that about other entrepreneurs talking about their journey, and a lot of like mindset people who had achieved something, and they kind of talk through it in like quotes and stuff like that. Like it's incredible how powerful that stuff is. Yeah. And so I relied a lot on that in the early days, especially, going through even just the first initial product like launch, and like it goes out there and it's never what you imagined, and there's problems, and you're so worried about it because it's your livelihood, it's your family's livelihood, and stuff goes sideways, and then you got to try and fix it, and you're rushing around. You've never been through this experience before, so it's all so incredibly stressful. I always describe it this way. So obviously, to answer the first part of your question, the changing your mindset, I don't want to sound cliche, but changing your mindset and very much training yourself to think in a very different manner, and that other people have done what you are trying to do, maybe in a different industry, but it's been done. So it's entirely possible, and that's that determination and drive, right? And the other part, you eventually kind of have to, as I'll describe it, become numb to the process. And I don't mean numb in a fact of like your company's falling apart and you're like, whatever. I mean, numb to the little things where the little things aren't as important and you're focusing on the bigger picture of it. So don't let those little issues creep into your, I guess, your mind and start to cloud your vision. You have to keep that vision. And I've always described it as you have to be numb to a certain extent, just the right amount.
That's perfectly well stated. And the word I couldn't get before, I just became numb, but numb to everything. And you have to find that perfect amount where that numbness is, because it can't be, the balance. Now, Flock Audio, how did you come up with the name? I heard a little guest in the background. Tell us.
Yes. So where Flock Audio came from, initially when I started the recording studio, it was called Alternative Promotions or ALT Promotions. And to me, like I'm very big into, you'll see from Flock Audio and our marketing and stuff like that. I'm big into the marketing, the branding, and the overall reputation of when you look at a Flock Audio product right down to the actual physical product, or you're seeing what you're seeing online. It is all very polished. I've always based pretty much everything I've ever done in life on that, but I guess my parents always described it as taking pride in your work. And that's how I've always been. It's how I've been wired. So anyways, started the recording studio, left my construction career and stuff like that. And I'll give a little bit of a backstory in a moment. I had a little buddy who would constantly be with me while I'd be mixing tracks. So clients would be gone and I'd be mixing tracks. And this little guy here would always be with me. And
now,
so
for those of you who are listening, you can't see.
Yeah.
Darren has just presented a beautiful, colorful-looking parrot on the screen.
Parrot, yeah. So his name is Benson, and he's a Gende Conure. And I've had him now, my wife and I have had him now for going on 10 years. We had him since he was a little baby. And so anyways, I would be mixing audio, and he would be sitting with me all the time, sitting on my lap, kind of similar to as we're doing the podcast right now, sitting on my lap or sitting on my shoulder and stuff like that. And he would sit with me for hours. Luckily, he's potty trained, so he doesn't ever go on me. I
was going to say, wait a minute. I've been in that scenario before. Benson is potty trained. Now you're going to have to teach me that trick.
So I took from that during the recording studio days. This was pre-becoming a manufacturer. And we were doing a lot of research, learning about this parrot that we got. And I'll kind of explain a little backstory in a moment. But to explain the origin and where the company name comes from is birds, unlike dogs and cats, don't look at you really as an alpha. They look at you as a flock member. So although we're of human, right? Descent, and obviously they're avian, they view us as they become bonded to you, is what it's described as a flock member. And so I'm like, that's kind of cool. Like it has a cool sort of ring to it. And so at first it was Flock Studios, and I just didn't, I never registered it, but I was just playing with names, and I was just like, it's not really right. And I ended up calling it Flock Audio, and that's what the recording studio was called. And so it was kind of cool that he became part of the origin of that. And in all honesty, I don't know if Flock Audio ever would have existed had we not got this little guy. Now, when we got him, this is the side story I wanted to tell. My wife, so we've been together 15 years. She, in the first X amount of years before we got Benson, was terrified of birds. I always liked birds.
Really?
Never had a problem with them. Terrified, deathly terrified. And so we were in a pet shop, and she was buying a little fish tank for her office where she worked in the medical industry. And so she had this little fish tank and this bag of fish, and she's walking down the aisle, and she was cutting through the cage area, and she didn't realize that there were parrots. And
boy.
All of a sudden, this little flash of colors you could see if you're watching the video, but I'll describe it like orange, green, blue, he's just full of colors, went darting off this cage onto her shoulder, and she just stops, and she freezes. And I'm behind her at this point. We're walking towards the till.
It went on her shoulder.
Yes, it ran across. She was just close enough that it ran across. And I'm like, don't move. And I thought for sure this fish tank, these fish are going flying. And so I'm like, don't move. A bird ran on your shoulder. And she's like, what? And immediately he starts kind of kissing her cheek and as we refer to in birds, like they preen. And she fell in love with him, just fell in love with him. And from that point on, we didn't end up taking him home that night. We went home because he was not a cheap buy, and I had just left my career. He was like $3,000.
Yeah, parrots are expensive.
Very. And so we were like, whatever. Like we're not going to take him home. And then I heard about him for a couple of days. She's like, I'd really like to go back and see him and stuff like that. And then it just ended up becoming history. We brought him home in a blizzard, and actually it's called in parrot lingo gotcha day, when you got the bird. And we ended up bringing him home on February 19th, I think it was, in a blizzard. We had no idea what we were doing. We stopped at the grocery store, grabbed some grapes and stuff.
Yeah.
And we brought him home, and he's been with us ever since. And then eventually kind of became part of the whole thing of Flock Audio. And he's actually in the very first debut video of when we announced the very first product, which is kind of cool. So
And he's in your logo.
we call him, we call him Benson the CEO. He can take the rap for the bad stuff.
That is such an awesome story. I had shared with Darren before the podcast. I grew up with tons of birds, an African gray parrot. And we were kind of joking back and forth. They mimic everything, so be very careful. And they talk a lot, although he's being incredible.
You know what? He's very well behaved, but like I was telling Andrew earlier on the podcast for the listeners, he has to be in the room with me because he's so bonded to me that if he was in his cage and I'm doing this podcast from my home, he would be calling to me. So it was just a better option. Sit on the lap, be quiet, do your thing, and I can get through doing the podcast. So that's why he's here.
So, and he's if you guys haven't seen the video version, you got to check it out just for this reason, because he's a very, very colorful, beautiful bird. So, Darren, so many questions I want to ask you, but you've been very gracious, so I'm not going to take up a tremendous amount more of your time. But there's a few things that we haven't hit that I think you have really good stories to tell and really good background or thoughts on. Number one,
sure.
Tell us about business partners. You hear you need them from some people. You hear you definitely don't want them from other people. What is your perspective, and can you be successful with business partners? Do you have to have them? Shouldn't you have them? I know you've had an experience in the past with business partners. Give us some insight. If someone's thinking about starting a business, they recognize they have a certain skill set, but they don't have the full suite to be successful, which is often the case. Not all of us have the skill sets across the gamut to be successful in business. Give us your perspective.
For sure. I don't think there is a black or white answer to it. I think it's very much an A and B answer, I guess, options A and B. Can you be successful with a partner because they add something to your team and they add that valued asset to it? Absolutely. And if you can find somebody you can work very well with and they can add that asset to it, it can be tremendously successful and relieve a lot of the sort of like early stress and strain on the copious amounts of work you have to do. I can only really speak from my experience. I'm the only founder of Flock Audio, but early on in early days, I did have somebody what I would consider would eventually become a partner in the business, and great guy, very knowledgeable. And I really, really enjoyed in the early days of talking about what Flock Audio would become. This is pre-shipping the product. This is just the early days of it. I think it could have been a tremendous relationship, but it didn't work out. And unfortunately, it happened at a time where it was like the last thing I needed and already a very difficult journey.
Isn't that how it always works? Timing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it didn't work out, and I kind of just moved on from it. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it with anybody else. I'm not going to try and get somebody else in and stuff like that. I'm going to do it on my own and kind of become that lone wolf in a sense. But it definitely makes the journey that, like we were discussing earlier, it becomes much more lonely because you don't have anybody to kind of like bounce ideas off of and just like discuss hurdles and literally just do the water cooler talk about, oh, this happened today, blah, 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 and just kind of like work through it. So do you need a partner? No. Many great companies have been successful and built upon one sole person doing it. Flock Audio can be a good example upon that. Can you do it with somebody? If you have somebody of a like-minded individual, they are as driven and passionate about your vision or a combined vision, by all means, yeah. But I would say regardless of, because you don't really know what you don't know, be cautious. Because the worst thing you can do is have a partner you think is really great and make it much further down the line. Like, for instance, our relationship ended early, and it can become so detrimentally dangerous to your overall vision, business, everything, and it could cause you a lot of hardships. So it's a really tough one to answer, but hopefully that kind of gives some insight to it.
That was such good advice from my experiences. I've had amazing business partners. I've had business partners that didn't work out. I'd be nowhere without my business partner in the garbage company, Jeff. And one of the things you said that was so key is, well, two key things that I want to point out. Make sure they're as driven as you are, because I will tell you, if you are in business with someone who, this is another one of those superficial things, right, that you experience. Friends, oh, let's go into business. We're great friends. Yeah, we're going to do all this. And then when things get tough, if one individual is far more driven, is at the office way more hours than the other one, putting in the hard work, that it will, as hard as you try, if you are the one that is the driven one, it will eat on you, and it will eat on you, and it will wear away, and it will eventually turn into something not so good.
It becomes very toxic, very bitter.
It does. That's a perfect word, toxic. And I've been in those experiences. And the sad thing there is, then you're not even, business itself is hard. You can't even focus on growing the business and the things in the business, and the whole environment turns to that toxicity. And if you've so for those of you who are out there, if you're in this scenario where you know that the business relationship isn't right, you need to act now. You should do something now. And it doesn't mean you treat anybody with disrespect, but you use such a good word, toxic. If you are in something that you would consider toxic, the business is going to suffer. It's really, really going to suffer. Your customers are going to be hurt. Your employees are going to be hurt. And then I think the other key thing that you said is like-minded vision. That's an interesting, it's kind of a challenge, because you don't want a yes man, because I think most of corporate America fails because all of the head suite wants yes men, and companies die because of that. But at the same time, you don't want someone that's always a hurdle or always a burden, and it's like, okay, we can't get anything done because it's, if I take this side, this person takes this side, so it's interesting that you said that, and I think that's such good advice for all of us and for our listeners to think about. If you're thinking about starting a business and you're not sure whether to get a business partner, I think you should listen to the last 8 minutes and you'll get a lot of great advice.
Definitely, I agree with you.
The last couple questions I'm going to ask you, and I've always told our listeners that there's 4 types of people. There are people that are born entrepreneurs that are, and they never try being an entrepreneur. There are people that are born entrepreneurs and they try being an entrepreneur and it works out great. There are people that aren't born entrepreneurs and they know that they're not entrepreneurs and they're happy working a 9 to 5 and our world would be nothing without them. And then there are people that aren't entrepreneurs that try to be entrepreneurs and they fail and they find that out. To me, the most challenging group, or the saddest group, is the people that are born to be entrepreneurs, but they never take the jump and they never actually try it. Now, in your entrepreneur article, you gave me a little bit different perspective. You don't believe that entrepreneurs are born. Although I'm going to challenge you, because a lot of the things you said about you as a kid, I could have told you entrepreneur, genetically an entrepreneur. But tell us your perspective on that idea of whether entrepreneurs are born or are they made.
So I guess I should elaborate a little bit more than what the article actually dug into in terms of what I view an entrepreneur versus what a creative person is. And so Jordan Peterson is another motivational speaker that I've taken a lot from. And he has this great analogy called the curse of creativity. Most people, and let's talk about the people who aren't entrepreneurs necessarily, if we're going to use that term right now. Everybody always, I wish I was creative like you. I remember when I was writing music and stuff like that, I wish I was creative like you. And what they don't realize is creativity is truly a curse, because it's a never-ending journey of unfulfillment. And I don't mean that in a sense of you don't achieve things, you're just never fulfilled. It's the same thing of kind of similar to the entrepreneur journey. So what I would describe people as, and like myself and stuff like that, early days I was a creator, not a content creator, not like yourself. I don't have that. I was a creative individual. I love to
Yep.
do certain things and create things and see the outcome of them. And then once I was done, I was on to the next one. Where I believe an entrepreneur comes into the actual picture is the business related side of it. Because you can have somebody who is, I mean, Apple is a perfect example of this, right?
Yeah.
Both Steve
Yeah.
Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a born, I shouldn't say, sorry, now I'm going back on my thing. Steve Jobs was a crafted entrepreneur. Steve Wozniak was a creator. So they're both technically still entrepreneurs because
Yeah.
the business was created. But Steve Jobs was an entrepreneur to take an otherwise creative idea that Steve Wozniak came up with and they conceptualized together. And he turned that into a business, right? Obviously with many other people involved at Apple.
Yeah.
But that would probably be the best way I can describe it if you know the Apple story. So when I said that I don't think entrepreneurs are born, I think creatives are born. I think entrepreneurs are crafted through countless hours of hard work, small wins, big falls, and eventually just kind of getting to that point of really learning business. Because to be an entrepreneur, you have to learn some form of business. I don't mean you have to go to business school to do it. I didn't. But you have to be willing and excited about learning certain aspects of the business. So the Apple one is the best way I can give an analogy to elaborate. Steve Jobs became an entrepreneur because he made something sellable. Steve Wozniak was a creative who had the idea and created, what I'm sitting here talking to you on.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's always, I view it as it's going to be a nature or nurture. I see both sides of it. I think that, and the point of this is I'm focusing on, for those of you who believe that you're entrepreneurs, and we're not talking about like you and I described, or, I want to start a business. Okay, saying you want to start a business is different than actually taking the actions and doing it. As we learned from our guest a couple weeks ago, you've got to execute. Words are meaningless if you don't actually.
It's action.
Yeah, it's all about action. What keeps you going every day? What drives you?
When it first started the company, it changes over time, I guess. And it's funny you ask this question because I think about this often. When I first started the business, it was all about, and as I described earlier on, creating a product. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about necessarily creating a life or fame or anything like that. It didn't really matter to me.
You could have been a famous singer. You didn't want that.
But it was about creating a product that people would use and being able to, this is amazing. I created something that long after I'm dust, as awful as that sounds, people still be using this product, and it's been used on countless productions and so on and so forth. So that's what it initially started out as. What drives me now, and again, it's going to sound somewhat cliche, is I look at like our little one. So he's almost 2, and I look at like my family, my wife, and my folks who work with the company, and then our employees as well. And I just look at them and I say, this is what drives me. Like, this can't fail. It cannot fail at this point because too many people rely on Flock Audio as a company, as a revenue generator to put money in their pockets for their families and for their lives. So it changed over the years. And like, I have some very great employees that I absolutely love, and they work incredibly hard for me. And I shouldn't say for me, it sounds so superficial, for our company.
No,
we're a team. And I just look at it and I say, like, this can't fail. We have to continue innovating. We have to continue building and growing this brand so all these people can be well taken care of. And at the end of the day, they get to go home at night and they get to say, we really made a difference and I got paid to do it. And I love to work for Flock. So it changed. It started out as just creating a brand and having people like use it, brand and product. And then it changed to now having to take care of people and making a good life for them.
I can tell that the culture at your company is thriving and well, and that is so important. And I think one of my favorite sayings is culture eats strategy for breakfast every day of the week and twice on Sundays. And that culture aspect, I can just hear it in your voice. I can just hear it in your voice, and I know if I went to work for Flock Audio, I know exactly what the company culture would be, and it's what everybody hopes their company culture would be. So I appreciate you sharing that piece. And I want everybody to take note. I always ask all of my guests, what drives you? not one of them that has been successful, or any of them, has money been the reason. Of course, you need to support your family, and it never is. And this is part of what you and I are, the superficial nature of our society is, oh, you be a business owner and then you'll have millions and millions of dollars. Well, nobody that goes into business is going in for the millions of dollars, because let me tell you, it's not worth it. What you have to do is not worth it, because money doesn't make you happy. I don't believe. My guess is you agree with that.
Absolutely. I mean, so many people think like when you start a company and it does gain success that you're just rolling in money and you're just like, there's so much money in your pocket. I guess I remember thinking that way too before I started a company, like, oh, so-and-so is a business owner, they're so lucky. I would say I work 10 times harder, probably earn 10 times less. If you're a good business owner, and especially like in the earlier days, and I would still consider, even though we're on our 6th year of being in business and, you know, growing so much, you reinvest a lot of that money back into the company because it's your livelihood. And it's not, you're right, it's not about the money. It just isn't. Money's a wonderful thing. It's a beautiful thing. It allows you to do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But if you're purely driven by money, and we see it on social media so much of, oh, come sign up for Microsoft, I'll show you how to earn 6 figures. Don't.
Drives me nuts.
Because they're not
Drives
going
me
to
nuts.
you.
Yeah.
That's called a pyramid scheme, and it's just a different way of elaborating it, right? It's just not going to work that way. Like, again, we are what I would consider a very successful company in our industry. We're a very small, but we operate as a very large company, patented products, you know, customers around the globe and stuff like that. But really what I get out of it every single day is it pays the bills. I get to come home to my family who are well taken care of. And at any point in time, I can really choose whatever direction I want us or the company to go into. And we think about that often, and we strategize different ways about it. And there's always going to be changes. So I like that fact. I'm not stuck in a rut, I guess, if that explains it.
Yeah.
So money isn't everything.
I think that's perfect.
To add one more thing, I've always said, even before I started this journey, when my wife and I both worked our other jobs, money will always come and go. You can always earn money, no matter what. But it will not necessarily ever make you happy, other than for a very brief moment. Just like when you buy something new, you buy a new iPhone or new car. It's exciting, but that will wear off very quickly. It's about being really fulfilled and happy in what you're doing and making the difference every single day.
I mean, that's so perfectly stated, Darren. It's fleeting. Money will always give you a fleeting amount of happiness. But what won't is loving what you do every day, having a family outside of family at your job, your family, relationships, these types of conversations where you can, relate. I can relate to basically, you and I just met today. We've conversed by email a couple times, but I feel like we're old friends because I can relate. We went completely different industries, but I know exactly what you've been through and vice versa because we've gone down this entrepreneurial path. And that brings so much, I just get inspired by having these conversations and makes me way happier than some amount of money in my billfold. Not that it's not important. We both recognize that, but Darren, is there anything that I could ask you a million more questions, but I'm not going to. And this has been so much fun. One of the most fun I've had. So thank you. Is there anything that you want to share with our listeners that you think is particularly important for people thinking about being in business, maybe for people who are in business struggling, maybe for people that are in business and they're doing really well, but they're chasing the tail, or they're anything you want to share to that you think is particularly useful that we haven't talked about?
I mean, we're learning this all the time. I guess probably, I don't want to sound too bad about this, but whatever goes up must come down. And what I mean by that is business may be really good this year, next year it may not be. So preparing for that is very important. And always kind of, once you do establish yourself, making sure that you're prepared that at any time stuff could go, not to the point where you really expected it to. Preparation.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying
Yeah.
to describe a simple thing of preparation. Be ready, because anything can happen. We saw the world change in the last 2 years in such a dramatic way, so abruptly, and being prepared for that can really help the overall lifeblood of your business and continue your drive, whether you are successful or you are just kind of starting out. Preparation is really key at one point or another. And I would say that's probably been one of the greatest things that I've learned, especially, in our company, preparation. So that means anything from cash flow woes to competitive products coming out and you didn't expect it, and to just keep your vision going. Preparation and stick to your vision.
I think that's incredible advice. I myself have I've had to learn that the hard way. And I think we all do to a certain extent, and that's how it's so important, the preparation and the planning aspect. Well, Darren, thank you so very much for your time. Benson, thank you for your time. This has been, as I said, extremely enjoyable, and I'm excited to see where Flock Audio goes next.
Definitely. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you asking me to come on the show.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Wow. What a fun conversation that was with Darren. That's all the time we have for this week's episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us again this Wednesday. Please remember, you can find more about the podcast and converse with us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @HollandPodcast. We continue the conversation outside the podcast. We talk about business, and it's overall a great opportunity for us to have conversation and make connections outside of the podcast. Of course, go to our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, where you get updates every single week when the video version is posted. And if you're not watching the video, you're going to want to watch the video for this week, because I'm telling you, Benson the parrot that Darren had is awesome and incredibly colorful and a beautiful representation for Flock Audio. Thank you so much for joining us. As a reminder, this is a business podcast, so we talk about legal, we talk about financial. Sometimes don't take anything you hear from a podcast and specifically apply it to your situation. Always make sure that you get the best advice for your particular situation before making any moves. Thank you again so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Everyone have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday for the Andrew Holland Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, @Holland Podcast. That's @Holland Podcast, for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.